Hello, thank you for inviting us to the International Conference on Traditional Building. I'm Anna Alvarez and this is Frank Martinez. We're from Martinez and Alvarez Architects, based out of Miami, Florida. We'll be showing you a house in Coral Gables that we refer to as the Greenway house.
So in this image, the second slide that's up now, we're actually seeing street views of the house along with an aerial view taken from a drone above. But what we'd like to do before we jump into the formal presentation of the house is to, of the house proper, is to give you a kind of overview of Coral Gables and its history and its origins. So in this next slide, Anna's gonna begin by telling us a little bit about that part of the story.
So just to give you a quick context, City of Coral Gables is a municipality in Greater Miami in South Florida. It was a planned community, imagined as both a city beautiful and as a garden city. It's comprised of neighborhoods and districts inspired by the architecture of Spain, Italy, and the Mediterranean in terms of its aesthetics and form. Next slide.
So in this next image, we're actually seeing a piece of that master plan, and it's surrounded by images that are part of the entrances and plazas of Coral Gables. The important point here that we're making is that the city, as a 20th century conception, was in fact thought of as a place that included both public and private spaces in a fashion based on tradition and with a focus on the human body and pedestrians and so forth. So as we look at the following slide, what we're laying out for you here at the top of the slide are some of the images that talk about Coral Gables' early civic spaces and buildings, and then below you see two images that are kind of street views as the city was under construction. One, the fabric buildings, which we call the fabric buildings commercial, meaning that which was both commercial and mixed use, and to the right, a street just under construction, showing actually one of the first model homes in Coral Gables, giving us a sense of the character of the fabric of that which would have been the, more often than not, the primary neighborhood domestic districts. The next slide.
This next slide shows some of the fabric buildings and commercial buildings, just to give you a sense of what the architecture in Coral Gables is like. And in the next slide, on the upper left-hand corner, this has more images of the domestic architecture.
So before we go to the next slide that Anna was going to be talking about, this is an image that shows, again, we keep saying fabric buildings. These are the fabric buildings that are part of the domestic realm of the city, or blocks that are primarily about dwelling and private dwelling. But what we want you to see is to get a sense of that early character of the city proper, so that if you just kind of look at the slide in a clockwise fashion, you'll see the prevalence for the kind of building materials, and of course the composition that always includes porches and loggias and galleries and so forth. Now in the next slide, Anna's going to kind of bring that together for us in terms of what the early architects were actually really thinking about and looking at.
So the early architects were known to have had extensive libraries that they used to draw their inspiration. And so the two images on the upper left hand of the slide show promotional postcards that showed built conditions, but used to lure tourists and residents alike to South Florida. And then in the middle, you'll see images from a surround in a building in Spain, in one of the books that we believe the early architects were looking at, and how this was transported to a building here in Coral Gables, known as the Fink Studio, the architectural offices of one of the early architects, George Fink. which we happen to be restoring now for the city of Coral Gables.
So we're very fortunate, as you see in this image, to be actually working on this project, the first architectural office by George Fink in the heart of the city. And if you just notice, the arrows are pointing to the upper image, which is actually the image from the south of Spain, and then of course the built project in the 20s that we see below. All of the images that you see here from varied parts of the south of Spain are actually buildings that were very important precedent references and direct referential models that the architects used to create this new work here in South Florida. So the next slide takes us now back to the project site.
So we're looking at an aerial bird's eye view of Coral Gables, a residential portion of Coral Gables, but as you can see, it has a church also from the 20s or 30s, a block and a half away. The Biltmore, which is one of the significant buildings in Coral Gables, and golf courses and the lush landscape that Coral Gables is known for.
The image on the right of the slide is one of the early, not the first, but one of the early sketches once we had the kind of design idea in place that talks about both how to use the site properly, the importance of a great oak tree that is, kind of in the center, not in the perfect center of the site, but in the upper left-hand quadrant of the site proper. And in those early sketches, you actually see that we were thinking both of the original architecture of Coral Gables as well as the presence of the Biltmore Towers, the Biltmore Hotel's tower, which is actually modeled in a direct reference to the Giralda in Sevilla, and it's one of 3 great buildings that were built here in South Florida based on that referential model. So
the house is organized as a side yard house with a courtyard and the oak tree beyond, with the main house facing the courtyard, and then a guest house with a garage in the ground floor, also overlooking the courtyard.
The images on the right of the slide, which again are both eye-level perspective and a perspective slightly from above, or a bird's eye, to give us a better understanding of basically the partie of the house, which is based on the historical example of the Charleston single house, which is a house that's main body is perpendicular to the street and the pedestrian right-of-way, as opposed to having its broad face on the street. This worked really well for us because it allowed us to use the great oak tree as part of that which would give spatial consistency and enclosure to the court. We'll move on to the next, well, before we do so, in this plan you actually see that one enters off the street into the loggia on the ground floor, and then one can enter, in a sense, the air-conditioned spaces of the house, where we have a series of rooms that are always visually interconnected. This notion of transparency was something that we were searching for. In the next slide, we actually see the second floor of the house within its immediate context, and really the program at the second floor, you see how one rises from the stair hall up to the second level. It's really the private rooms of the house, which consist of 3 bedrooms. 2 of those bedrooms actually share and are interconnected by the loggia, the second floor loggia, which is part of that stacked loggia, and the photograph on the right of the slide actually shows you that composition, that ensemble, the entry loggia below, and then of course the shared loggia on the second floor by those 2 rooms. The room towards the inner garden of the house, or the back, is the master bedroom suite, and then across the court, on top of the what we call the carriage house above the garage, is actually a guest suite for the house. In this next slide, we're looking at the west elevation of the house, or actually the front elevation of the house. The house is, as we said earlier, is composed in a fashion where the thin facade of the body is that which fronts the street. So in the spirit of the early houses of Coral Gables, we have this idea that the garden walls, the landscape proper, it's all an ensemble. So the wall that connects the main body of the house to the carriage house, not only does it afford spatial enclosure for the courtyard, but it also sort of brings into the composition the great oak tree, which provides a great canopy beyond. On the upper right, we see one of the early what we call trash paper sketches for the drawing, and then the importance of the manner in which you enter the house. The next slide is showing us
the stacked loggias overlooking the courtyard, and the the composition of the second story and one story volume overlooking the courtyard.
And then that's followed by a slide which is showing the building sections of the house. This is important because essentially we're looking at a longitudinal section that's running from the street all the way through to a small portion of the house that quite literally sort of pushes itself into the garden, and then the section above is showing us the main body of the house, and then across from it, across the courtyard, the carriage house, and the photographs are taken strategically so that we have both a view of the ground floor loggia / porch of the carriage house, and then looking from that porch across the courtyard to the stacked gallery. That photograph happens to be an early construction photo, but you've seen it in complete stage in others. And now the next slide takes us inside the house.
So this is the upper left-hand slide, shows the great room that illustrates what Frank was touching upon, that the rooms have a visual connection, or what the owners referred to as request for modern living, where you can see from one room into the other. And the right-hand slide shows the stair hall that opens onto the gray space with the office alcove on your left.
And the interesting thing about the stair hall, if you notice in the photograph, it's actually bringing light from the second floor all the way down to the great room, as well as the transparency, not only to the big room, but to the alcove. On the lower left-hand photo, it's actually, it's the room that, in a sense, sort of pushes out into the garden, and in this image currently uses as a form of sitting room or family room.
And this is the gate to the porch that we designed that acts as the front door. It's made out of mahogany. So in the spirit of searching for materials that have some longevity and are, that work well in this climate, we designed this gate and used native landscape, coral stone, and other materials found locally.
This is very important to us because this, in fact, is the front door of the house. When one opens the front door, you're actually entering a gallery or an open air space, but certainly covered. In the next slide, we're actually looking at some details, and we simply wanted to show or give you a sense of the fact that it is a block and concrete house with a stucco finish in the tradition, in a kind of South Florida tradition, and with a stucco finish that is not meant to be hyper pristine, but actually showing the hand of the workman. The use of wood is limited, but of course we use it for the roof and roofing components, as well as the rafters and so forth that you see in the image on the right. And then in certain instances we'll do things like the concrete beam that you see there, which is actually exposed concrete that we simply cleaned up a bit and chose to sort of express, you know, its characteristics. And then of course, as a final slide, we go back to that original concept sketch. But more than anything, we'd just like to thank you all for this opportunity to show you our work, and hoping, actually purposefully making the presentation and this PowerPoint presentation slightly different than the article, but in an effort to give you a broader picture of the architecture of place, which is our hometown of Coral Gables. Thank you so much.
Thank you.